When wisdom wore braids. The lecture hall at Sterling University had seen 47 years of equations scrawled across its blackboards, but nothing quite like this autumn morning in 2019. Professor Edmund Gray stood before a sea of graduate students, his silver hair catching the light from the tall windows, his weathered hands gripping a piece of chalk that seemed to tremble slightly. He was 72 years old, and in all his decades of teaching advanced mathematics, he had never invited a child into his classroom. But today was different. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime chasing proofs and certainties. What you see behind me is known as the Hartwell conjecture. First proposed in 1819. 207 years of the brightest minds in mathematics, and not one solution. The equation sprawled across the board like a dragon sleeping on a mountain of symbols. His graduate students, all in their 20s and 30s, leaned forward with the hunger of youth, notebooks open, pens ready. I've dedicated 30 years to this problem, Professor Gray continued, adjusting his thick-framed glasses. And I've invited someone special today who has been attending our community mathematics workshops. He gestured toward the back of the hall. The heavy oak door creaked open, and in walked Maya Peterson, 9 years old, her hair pulled into neat braids adorned with colorful beads that clicked softly as she moved. She wore a navy blue school dress with a white collar, and her brown eyes were wide but steady as she took in the enormous lecture hall filled with adults. Her grandmother, Dorothy Peterson, 68 years old, stood quietly by the door. She had raised Maya since she was 3, after Maya's parents died in a car accident. Dorothy worked as a seamstress in their small neighborhood, her fingers worn from years of threading needles, but her heart was full of fierce love for her granddaughter. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Some students exchanged puzzled glances. Others whispered. "Professor, is this some kind of demonstration?" asked a student named James from the third row, his tone carrying a hint of condescension. Professor Gray raised his hand for silence. "Maya has been attending our Saturday community workshops for gifted students. Last week, she showed me something remarkable. Something I initially dismissed." His voice cracked slightly. "I dismissed it because I thought I knew better. Because in 47 years of teaching, I had become certain about what was possible and what was not." Maya walked slowly down the center aisle, her small footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Her grandmother watched from the doorway, hands clasped together, lips moving in silent prayer. When Maya reached the front, she barely came up to Professor Gray's elbow. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level, and handed her the chalk. His hands were shaking. "Show them, Maya. Show them what you showed me." Maya turned to face the blackboard. The equation loomed over her like a giant. For a moment, she just stood there, and the room held its breath. Then she raised her hand. "May I?" she asked softly, looking back at the professor. He nodded, tears already forming in his eyes, though he tried to hide them behind his glasses. Maya began to write. Her handwriting was careful, the letters of a child still learning to form symbols properly. But what she wrote made perfect sense. She started with something simple, something that every mathematician in that room had overlooked for 2 centuries. She rewrote part of the equation using a substitution so elegant, so obvious in hindsight, that it made the impossible suddenly visible. The room erupted. Not with applause, but with chaos. Students stood up. Notebooks clattered to the floor. Voices rose in excitement and disbelief. "Wait, that actually works," gasped Jennifer, a doctoral candidate in her 5th year. She was frantically writing in her own notebook, checking Maya's work. "She's simplifying the tertiary variables," another student called out. "Why didn't we see that?" "Because we were looking for complexity," Professor Gray said quietly, his voice barely audible above the commotion. "We spent 200 years assuming the answer had to be as complicated as the problem." Maya continued writing, her small hand moving steadily across the board. She showed how the substitution revealed a pattern, and that pattern collapsed the equation into something solvable. It wasn't a complete proof yet, but it was the key that unlocked the door everyone had been pushing against for centuries. When she finished, she turned around, chalk dust on her fingers, and looked up at Professor Gray with uncertain eyes. "Is that right?" she asked. The room had gone silent again, but this silence was different. It was the silence of wonder, the kind that falls over people when they witness something that changes their understanding of the world. Professor Gray knelt down again, and this time he didn't try to hide his tears. They ran freely down his weathered face, catching in the lines that years of laughter and frustration had carved there. "Maya," he whispered, "in all my life, I have never been more honored to be proven wrong." The room erupted again, but this time with thunderous applause. Students stood, clapping, some of them crying too. Dorothy Peterson ran down the aisle, her worn shoes slapping against the floor, and swept her granddaughter into her arms. "Baby girl," she whispered into Maya's braids, "your mama and daddy would be so proud." Maya hugged her grandmother tight, the chalk still in her hand, leaving a small white mark on Dorothy's sleeve that she would never wash out. In the weeks that followed, the mathematics community verified Maya's insight. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was the breakthrough that made the solution possible. Professors at institutions around the world began building on her foundation. Within a year, the Hartwell conjecture was fully solved, and Maya Peterson's name appeared in the acknowledgments of every paper written about it. But that's not really what this story is about. 3 months after that morning in the lecture hall, on a cold December evening, Maya sat with her grandmother in their small apartment above the tailor shop. The windows were frosted over, and the old radiator clanked and hissed, filling the room with warmth. Dorothy was sewing a wedding dress for a client, her glasses perched on her nose, her fingers moving with the practiced grace of someone who had spent a lifetime making beautiful things. "Grandma," Maya asked, "why do you think people didn't believe I could do it?" Dorothy set down her needle and thread. She looked at her granddaughter with eyes that had seen decades of joy and sorrow, of prejudice and persistence, of a world that often judged people by what they looked like rather than what they carried inside them. "Baby," she said gently, "some people spend so long looking in one direction that they forget to look around them. They forget that wisdom doesn't have an age or a color or a particular shape. It just is. And it shows up in the most unexpected places, if we're humble enough to recognize it." "Professor Gray recognized it," Maya said. "He did," Dorothy nodded. "Because he was brave enough to admit he didn't know everything. That's a rare gift, especially in someone who has studied for so long. Most people, when they get older, they think they've seen all there is to see. But the wise ones, they keep their hearts open. They keep learning." Maya was quiet for a moment, watching her grandmother's hands work the needle through the delicate fabric. "I miss Mama and Daddy," she said softly. Dorothy's hands stilled. She set the dress aside and pulled Maya into her lap, even though the girl was getting too big for it, really. She held her granddaughter close and rocked her gently. "I know, baby. I miss them too. Every single day." Her voice was thick with emotion. "But they left us with each other, and they left you with that beautiful mind of yours. And you know what I think? I think they're up there watching, celebrating every moment." Maya buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of fabric softener and lavender. "Grandma, what if I can't do it again? What if that was the only special thing I ever do?" Dorothy pulled back and looked her granddaughter in the eyes. "Maya Louise Peterson, you listen to me. What you did in that lecture hall wasn't special because you solved some old problem. It was special because you had the courage to raise your hand. You had the courage to say, 'I can,' when everyone expected you to stay quiet. That courage, baby girl, that's what's special. And that doesn't run out. That's yours forever." As the winter evening deepened into night, grandmother and granddaughter sat together in their small apartment, holding each other against the cold. Outside, the world rushed by, busy and complicated. But inside, there was warmth and love, and the quiet certainty that they would face whatever came next together. Professor Edmund Gray visited them sometimes, on Saturday afternoons. He would bring mathematics puzzles, but mostly he would just sit and drink the sweet tea Dorothy made, and talk about life and learning and the beautiful humility of not knowing everything. On one such visit, as Maya worked on a puzzle at the kitchen table, Dorothy and Edmund sat by the window, watching the neighborhood children play in the street below. "You gave me a gift that day, Dorothy," Edmund said quietly. "You raised a child who sees the world differently. Who isn't afraid to question what everyone else accepts." Dorothy smiled. "I just loved her. The rest, that's all Maya." "No," Edmund shook his head. "Love is the foundation. It's what makes brilliance possible. It's what makes courage possible. You gave her that." They sat in comfortable silence, two people from different worlds brought together by a child's raised hand, by the universal language of numbers, and by the deeper universal language of human connection. Years would pass. Maya would grow up, attend university, become a mathematician herself. But she would never forget that morning in the lecture hall, or the lessons her grandmother taught her on quiet winter evenings. She would remember that wisdom can come from anywhere. That courage means raising your hand even when you're the smallest person in the room. That love is the equation that solves everything else. And sometimes, late at night when working on a particularly difficult problem, she would hear her grandmother's voice, "You have the courage to say I can, baby girl. That's yours forever." That voice, more than any equation, more than any proof, would guide her through life. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the Black Voices. Leave a comment below telling us about a time when you had the courage to raise your hand, or when someone believed in you when others doubted. Your story matters, and we want to hear it. Together, we celebrate the voices that deserve to be heard.